Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is This Sunday Show on Hromadske International, the only primetime TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I'm Natalia Humanyuk. That's what we have for you tonight. A series of high-level meetings on Ukraine, Poroshenko with Tillerson and Lagarde, Volker with Surkov. What do we know? How did populist Milos Zeman win the second round of Czechia's elections? The Russian opposition marches for boycotting the presidential elections. Stalin died, people laughed, Russia wasn't happy. We look at the film Moscow Just Banned. What are the challenges of historical memory in Eastern Europe? We speak with historian Andrei Portnov. Number of high-profile meetings have taken place this week. Ukrainian President Poroshenko met with the U.S. Secretaries of State Rex Tillerson during the Davos Economic Forum. As well, he had the meeting with the International Monetary Managing Director Christine Lagarde. Beyond that, international analysts and foreign politicians had a chance to question the Ukrainian leader on the progress of the reforms, including setting up an anti-corruption court. As well, they asked the president if he will seek a second term. Oleksandr Sushko is one of the top Ukrainian experts on Ukraine's transatlantic relations and the new executive director on the Renaissance Foundations. He'll just return from Davos, and in a few seconds he'll join this studio. Before, we would like to make a quote of the president while he stressed that he will, what we would like to listen.
I am organizing the fighting against corruption in Ukraine not because of it is visa-free and not because of the tranche of IMF, because fighting against corruption is priority of my presidential policy. This is me who created the independent anti-corruption institution, NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, which is effectively functioning together with other institutions and deliver the first very promising results. And it is supported both by our international partners and inside the country. We provide judicial reform with a full reloading of the Supreme Court and the court system in Ukraine. And on the 22nd of December, I initiated in the parliament the new anti-corruption court as a finishing structure for the independent anti-corruption system.
So that was the quote of the president, but before, you've just come back from Davos, and you've been to the Ukrainian lunch, which is organized already for the decades. So what were the highlights? What were the most important? What is the atmosphere? What are the foreign politicians first of all interested to hear from the Ukrainian leader? And about what's going on in Ukraine?
I think that the major, I would say, surprise to me is that the most of the international politicians whom I met were rather inclined to ask questions about Ukraine than provide recommendations. So the major attitude was a kind of the question to Ukraine to explain what's going on in the country. So it is not so easy for the most of the international actors just to say what to do. It would be very, I would say, naive to say that everybody knows what Ukraine must do. It is not so easy. So that is why the most of the politicians, the most of the counterparts we met were rather about the asking questions, not giving us receipt what we can do, what we should do.
But before, probably the last and the most interesting meeting was with the U.S. head of the State Department, Rex Tillerson. There were expectations that Ukrainian president will meet Donald Trump, but there was a lot of excitement about Donald Trump finally, the U.S. president, coming to Davos, so that meeting hadn't happened. What we know about the results of that meeting, because the and how we can, now explain and describe the state of the US-Ukraine relations, also with those promises and this expectation to get a defense lethal weapon from the US.
So the major point of these talks was about coordination of the major points and positions between two governments where it is possible. So it is very important that on the highest level there is a continuous process of coordination, because the only way to achieve some progress in the very complicated issue of our conflict with Russia is to have coordinated position with our Western allies. And here I think that with the U.S. Secretary of State, it was exactly the point when on the top level the positions on what we are looking for was discussed. So it is really important that both United States and Ukraine are looking for coordinated approach and on various issues, how to deal with peacekeepers mission, which is discussed, what to do with the sequence of steps when it comes to the Minsk agreement implementation, and what about the conditionality, which usually is important when it comes to American assistance to Ukraine, and in particular American position in the international financial institutions. For example, we know that there is a big debate about the Ukrainian incompliance with some conditions which International Monetary Fund raises in order to give Ukraine a continuation of its program. So, and I think that it was also debated. But the major point with Tillerson was about Donbass, I'm sure. And that was exactly the case when we are in the process of the big bargain over the idea of international peacekeepers. And I think that this is very important to be on the same page with the United States on this issue.
We also, at Davos, Poroshenko, Ukrainian president, has boasted about his anti-corruption efforts, and of course there were the questions about if the anti-corruption court would be established. So really, how strong is the position of the Western partners, and how big is really this issue?
I think it is quite. There is no full unanimity of the various actors on this issue. For some. We know that for Trump administration, maybe this anti-corruption agenda is not so much in the focus like in the previous Obama's administration. However, what we may identify is that personally for the State Secretary Tillerson, this is very important part of the agenda, and certainly United States is among those actors who strongly require from Ukraine to establish really independent anti-corruption court. And certainly this issue was raised during all the meetings which Ukrainian top official had.
One of the most important meetings was, of course, with the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, but as well, it was like a pretty positive feedback we hear that things are moving on. But really, what would be the criteria? What you can, write? What we can read to be a successful? What could be considered to be success? In particularly for IMF, for further cooperation.
I think that the issue with IMF is not easy. It is really complicated. It is really not just limited to the issue of anti-corruption court. I think if it is just only about the court, it some way will the progress may be ensured. But we have much more complicated issues there, especially when it comes to the land reform, introduction of the full-scale land market. which is, you know, the idea is very rational but very unpopular here in Ukraine. And it is very unlikely that the most of political forces will vote for that before elections. And so that makes me a little bit skeptical when it comes to the prospect of the next stages of cooperation with IMF. It is really needed, and Ukraine is will need external funds in order to pay for the debts next year. And the question is where there are maybe not so much sources when Ukraine can get it. But again, the price which IMF now requires is quite higher. And the anti-corruption court is just one of them. And as far as I understand, on the Ukrainian political level, there are hesitations. If the leaders of the country and the government, how they count, if they can survive without these funds or not before elections. Because really, there are some very painful requirements which they feel, I mean, the leaders of the country feel very uncomfortable to push forward before elections.
Beside that, what I understand from other analysts, that the issue of privatization is also on the top, because, you know, the land reform looks a bit like less likely, and it's not something which is really expected. But those are the issues which are expected. What are your thoughts on that?
So here there is a big question: where is the benchmark? So because if certainly there is a step done just a few weeks ago that the new legislation was adopted, which make easier to put forward privatization. It was a new law adopted. But probably it is not sufficient to be successful, because now the assets are the prices of the major assets are not higher, and the expectations of the government again quite different from they can get immediately. So, and the case of Odessa port plant, for example, was an example how the difficulty. So really, any asset may expect same problem when it is pushed for privatization. So the question, if where is the benchmark? So we don't know that, certainly, if the benchmark is a proper conditions, transparent rules, which allow any international investor to come and to buy, it can be achieved. But on the other hand, if the benchmark is successful contract done on privatization, I'm not so sure, because we may look back and we will see that all the efforts to sell any essential asset failed last couple of years. So could we expect this change? I'm not sure. Maybe lots of efforts to be done in order to get success here, because it is not sufficient from the government just to adopt the legislation. It is also important to attract real investors and to accomplish a deal.
Oleksandr, so overall, I mean, it's not the first year you are there. Why this meeting, or like this Davos visit? It's not exactly where the decisions are taken, but for us, for the Ukrainians, it's where we can, how we are saying, measure the temperature. You know, are people speaking that reforms are too slow? Are they more concerned about Russian aggression? So, at that regard, what are really? We already discussed some issues, but if to sum it up, you know, what was the mood? What would be the words you would describe in Ukraine's relations with its partners?
So it's very easy to say that reforms are slow. It's also very easy to say that Ukraine is not so much successful as somebody may expect. But what is more important is to what extent Ukraine is a part of the global processes. If it is going closer to the leaders of the world, or it is going to the margin, becoming the actor who is not in the focus, not just in the focus, but also not moving toward the mainstream of the global development. And here, that was a major question at the meeting. So if Ukraine may succeed, not just improve its GDP, not just improve its ratings like corruption perception ratings or doing business ratings, but mostly it is about, is Ukraine coming closer to the global trends of economy? And so I think that the positive part of the answer is that this is my observation, is that more and more actors, including Ukrainian politicians, businessmen, really understand that this is important.
At the same time, this Friday, during the last meeting of the President with the State Secretary Tillerson, the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine Negotiations Kurt Volker had met with the Russian Presidential Assistant Vladislav Surkov. They've met in Dubai. This time, according to the Russian official media, they talked about the prospect of sending UN peacekeepers to Donbass. I would like to show what the Russian politician had said. So we would hear that. The quote of Vladislav Surkov.
The main thing in the U.S. proposal is a rather detailed plan for a phased deployment of the UN mission in coordination with the implementation of the political points of the Minsk agreements. This is a balanced approach on which we have insisted. We will study it carefully and promptly give an answer. Then we will invite Kurt and his colleagues to a new meeting.
We know just what we know from the Russian media so far. We're waiting for the time when Kurt Volker would comment the issue himself. But really, besides what we already discussed, how probable so far looks this launching of the UN peacekeepers mission? From what you can hear on the sidewalks of the forum, talking to the experts, European, Americans, maybe Ukrainians as well.
I would like to hear from the U.S. part what kind of progress they may identify if they do. Because here we do not have any concrete information on the issues which were resolved, if they were resolved. My perception is main parts are still far from the consensus on the major issues. For example, I understand that the major issue is who and which way the peacekeeping mission is created, what would be the procedure, who will control, what will be the place, what will be the mandate of this peacekeeping mission. For example, for Ukraine, the most important thing is that Russia is not a part of this peacekeeping mission. For Russia, the major point is that Russia is essential part of this mission. If there is some process, some progress possible to achieve at least some steps in order to accommodate these two antagonistic positions, I don't know. I didn't have any indication of the progress on these particular issues. And then, as many others, certainly there is some, I would say, efforts, and these efforts are significant from various sides, to achieve at least something, at least some progress to achieve and then to report. Because otherwise it will look like a failure, total failure, which is not in the interests of major actors. So they probably need to identify at least some progress to report. But when it comes to the final solution, I think that we are still far from it.
Thank you. Oleksandr Sushko is now the executive director of the International Renaissance Foundations here in Kiev and one of the best Ukrainian experts on the Ukrainian transatlantic relations, just coming from Davos. Thanks for elaborating what was there. But on the same day, the United States Department of Treasury published an expanded list of sanctions against individuals and companies connected to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The list includes 21 citizens of Russia or Ukraine and 12 companies. What is interesting that among the long list of so-called ministers of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, we have a few Russian officials. For instance, Andrei Cherezov, Russia's Deputy Minister of Energy, and Yevgeny Grabchak, Director of Russia's Department of Operative Electricity Control and Management. What is important, they were previously reported to be the curators from the Kremlin, which already makes the clear connection between the Kremlin and so-called self-proclaimed Republic of Donbass, at least according to the U.S. Treasury. There would be more sanctions this week. Next week we are following, but you can read more on our website, especially this article, which is giving the list and more explanation about that. So we would like you to go to our webpage, and besides that, there you can see the full version of our tweet of our reports as well. Go to our Facebook page, search Hromadske International as well. Go to our Twitter, where you can, while Googling Hromadske, can also see the full version of our reports. We'd like to encourage also you to go and watch our special report on how people displaced by the conflict in Ukraine are rebuilding villages around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
Yulia fled with her family from the war in the east of Ukraine to the Chernobyl zone. They moved from separatist-controlled Makiivka to Radinka. The village is 50 kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. A house in the village costs the family 100 hryvnias, or $4 a month. They have no intention of returning to Makiivka. And they're not the only displaced people around. After the nuclear explosion in 1986, the area was depopulated. It turned into a zone of enhanced radiological control. Now, 30 years later, some of the villages are being restored. New settlers include displaced people from Donbass. Yevgen and Olga were forced to flee from the separatists of the DPR. Olga worked as the deputy director of a mine. Militants threatened her and her family. They moved from Yunakiev to the small village of Bazar. The family moved almost all of their furniture, 10 cats and 2 dogs. Yevhen and Olga pay less than 20 hryvnias, or $1 a month, for their house.
This weekend, Czechia has re-elected Milos Zeman as president in the second round of the elections. When we would look to the chart, you can see that Zeman has received 51.4% to 48.6%, compared to the former head of the National Academy of Science, Jiří Drahoš. Zeman is known for giving voice to rising Euroskeptics and anti-immigration sentiments within Czechia. He has also supported lifting the sanctions against Russia and recognizing Moscow's illegal annexation of Crimea. Hromadske spoke with Czech journalist Veronika Pehe to find out how Zeman managed to score the victory and what it means for the European country.
Well, the problem is Milos Zeman announced initially that he would not take part in any television debates. He then changed his mind in the second round, perhaps taking the Drahoš team by surprise. So Drahoš seemed somewhat unprepared in those debates. The first debate in which the two candidates met was on a commercial TV channel, and it has to be said that that commercial television definitely designed questions and topics which favored Zeman. So the main topics that were discussed in that debate was whether smoking should be allowed again in pubs and in public places, which is currently banned since last year in the Czech Republic, a topic that Milos Zeman is known to be very vocal on. He's very much in support of smoking in pubs and restaurants. And another topic that took up a major part of that debate was the right to hold guns, the right to arms. So again, a topic that very much favored Zeman. Zeman is known to be in favor of liberalizing the current legislation on gun ownership in the Czech Republic. Jiří Drahoš was more cautious on this topic, and simply he didn't perform very well with those questions on which or on these topics for which Zeman is known to be kind of a very strong campaigner. The second debate was on public television. The questions were designed, let's say, much more objectively, but still, Drahoš's style was to attack Zeman, perhaps not very convincingly, and it seems that the only topic where he really kind of managed to get on top of Zeman was in the case of foreign policy and relations with Russia. But apart from that, also, again, Zeman seemed to be much more convincing on a whole range of other topics. Drahoš simply seemed to be taken by surprise at times by the questions.
Despite presidential figure is not really strong in Czech politics, what does Zeman's victory mean for Czech Republic for the next 5 years, in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. Well, the presidential function is not very strong officially, constitutionally, but Milos Zeman is very good at interpreting the constitution very flexibly, let's say. So he's definitely doing as much as he can extend the powers of the presidential mandate. And what we can expect is, I think, more of the same of what we already saw in the past years. So definitely a clear alliance between the president and right-wing forces. When he announced his victory at his press conference just an hour ago or so, the two people standing closest to him were Tomio Okamura, the leader of this extremist right-wing party, and Milan Chovanec, the leader of the current Social Democrats, who's also very much known to be taking the Social Democrats in a kind of more nationalist direction. So there's more of that. There'll be more of a kind of pro-Russian orientation as well. Milos Zeman is very much known for his admiration and close ties to Vladimir Putin. He's also known for his frequent business trips to China. So certainly in foreign policy on the part of the president, we'll see more orientation towards the east. Although, as I said, it's unclear whether the government under Andrej Babiš will also emulate that kind of tendency because, after all, Babiš's pro-European interests might be stronger.
Today, supporters of Russia's opposition marched in cities across the country to call for a boycott of the upcoming March 18th presidential elections. According to Russia's Interior Ministry, more than 4,500 people demonstrated over 46 of the country's regions. And according to the Overday.info non-governmental organization, around 250 people have been detained by law enforcement. One of those people was opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was tackled by police in Moscow and forced into a police bus. The anti-corruption activist had been banned from running for president elections after being found guilty of embezzlement in a criminal case widely believed to be politically motivated. But he has still spent the last year traveling across the country and campaigning. We have Andrew Roth, Moscow-based Washington correspondent, live from Moscow, talking to us. Andrew, so how big were the protests? We are really, thanks for joining us, first of all, but really, how significant is that event? Because I think everybody looking forward for the elections and looking for some kind of protest to take place.
Hi, Natalia. Thanks for having me. You know, the protests, I would say today weren't as large as protests that we've seen in the past, definitely in comparison to what we saw in June, where there were a lot more people out and there were a lot more people who were arrested. You know, it's surprising because the elections are so soon, they're happening in a month, but I think that it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin is going to have a strong victory in the elections. The question right now is all about turnout. You know, the Kremlin really wanted to see this strategy of 70-70, that 70% turnout, 70% of people voting for Putin. Navalny's trying to spoil that by bringing people out onto the streets and organizing a boycott of the vote. We saw a lot of breadth today, so a lot of cities that took part, but compared to past elections, the numbers weren't as, compared to past protests, the numbers really weren't as high.
Are that really just the Navalny supporters this time? Because the last year protest, they were more about, they were not so much about Navalny himself, but more about anti-Putin or anti-Medvedev protest, anti-government protest. So were this really political? And if his political force, Navalny political force, is arguing for boycotting, how it's seen by, for instance, those opposition candidates like Ksenia Sobchak who are taking part in the elections?
Yeah, it's a really divisive issue at the moment. I think that, I mean, even within those people who really support Navalny or really support a kind of a strong turn away from Putin, there is still this sort of like existential question, I would say, to a certain degree. If you disagree with Putin, do you sort of vote against him like we had in the 2012 elections? Or do you just completely decide not to vote at all, what used to be called protiv всех in Russia, the kind of against all option that at this point is just represented by people who don't support him? So Navalny's broken with a lot of the other people who are opposition candidates. You know that there's an opinion among a lot of people that Sobchak, for instance, who is an opposition candidate, is actually a spoiler and is designed to get people excited about these elections. That could be a reason why we didn't see as many people out on the streets today. To be honest, I think it's more about weather conditions. It's cold out. I think that when people want to go out in the summer, because there is a very sort of social component to protesting, that right now those sort of winter protests, just the amount of energy that's going on, a lot of the other things that are happening in the moment in politics in Russia, I think that that's more the reason that we should look for why there might not have been as many people out on the streets today. It doesn't always mean that the number of people who come out are specifically the number of people who support or kind of agree with Navalny's approach to elections. That, there should be a boycott.
It will be cold till the mid of March in Russia. That's what we for sure can say. It won't be much warmer. But really about those arrests, I know it's sometimes, people are getting used that the people are arrested. So, and it happens that later they are freed, those who had been arrested. Is it more or less the same thing this time?
I've been here for a long time, so I've kind of seen people being arrested for a long period. I haven't been down to the courts yet tonight, so I'm not sure about the situation. From what I've heard, a lot of the people have been released. It's not like in June where there was a really high level of confusion about how many people were arrested, how many people were going to be held for a long period of time. When there are smaller crowds, Moscow police are better, Russian police are better at processing them. To be honest, the biggest kind of reason that you'll see people be imprisoned for a long period of time is because police stations don't know how to deal with protesters. So when you start involving these kind of like regional sticks, kind of police officers who aren't used to dealing with protesters, that's when you have kind of people being in jail for 15 days or longer. I haven't seen the latest data, so I'm not sure if Navalny's out at the moment. But I would assume that most of the protesters who were picked up are going to be out tonight. It's not going to be the kind of long-term holding that we would see earlier this year or even back in 2012 or 2013.
Andrew, thanks a lot for explaining it all to our audience. That was Andrew Roth, currently the Washington Post correspondent based in Moscow. And we'll be back in a second. This week, the Russian Culture Ministry also bans screening of the film The Death of Stalin. The new British-French comedy by director Armando Iannucci satirizes the power struggle that occurred after the death of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in 1953. But the Russian authorities have found the film offensive and potentially even extremist, to the point that they even sent police to stop a screening. Here's how the head of the Russian Military Historical Society's Department of Information described the film.
Film
It cannot be shown. The film is very unpleasant. And, you know, this type of story is, first of all, quite boring. And I think as a film, even if we disregard any type of context, it is not interesting. The plot is poorly developed and the characters as well. That is first. Secondly, it makes a very unpleasant, despicable impression. This film is quite vile. The film characters are the ministers of the then USSR. They are generalissimus, including the Marshal of Victory, Georgy Zhukov. They were truly shown in this movie as imbeciles and morons. Yes, they were perhaps tyrants. From the point of view of all human values, they were not good people. We won't judge this now. But we can say without a doubt that they were not imbeciles and morons. But here they are depicted exactly that way.
But not all Russians agreed with the point of view. Let's have a look at what several Russians who saw the film had to say.
It doesn't hurt my feelings at all. Why should it? I have my own opinion and I don't care about the others. But the fact is, I didn't have a childhood. I had no youth and I blame Stalin for that. I didn't laugh. No, there were certain moments that were funny, but I didn't laugh all the same. I cannot laugh at it because it is my life.
Very talented acting, talented production, and everything is shown quite reasonably. There is nothing offensive there. It is sad that it was people from the outside who looked at us that way and not us. We had to make such a film ourselves.
My colleague Matthew Kupfer talked to Matthew Bodner, a journalist in Moscow who was at the theater when Russian police arrived to learn more about the controversy.
The big question here is what are they exactly afraid of? And one thing that really resonated with me is I was at the movie theater where it was shown twice here in Russia, the only two showings. And I ran into a young man about 27 years old who walked out of the movie into a crowd of cops who were waiting to investigate whether or not the movie had actually played, apparently. And he felt that the movie had a lot of strong, it resonated quite strongly with contemporary issues here in Russia. And he looked around at all the cops and he pointed at them and look at all these uniformed men trying to ban art for the sake of ideology or something. And really, the big takeaway here is that Stalin, in particular, Stalin's actions during the Second World War have become maybe the critical focal point of Russia's contemporary narrative about what the Russian state is, where it comes from, and where it's going. And in the absence of any sort of constructive future vision, everything is predicated on this idea of having strong leaders in the past who saved the nation and sort of the state above all. And so what I think they're most afraid of is people laughing at the state. And one side comment this young man said to me is that he felt that the mechanisms displayed in the movie about all these high-level politicians jockeying for power, to him felt a lot like the way the machinations of power today. And so it's possible that when the Culture Ministry held its private viewing of this film last Monday, it hit things on it hit too close to home, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the formal reasons are that it's offensive, it mocks Russian history, and there was of course this buzzword possible extremism thrown around.
Mm-hmm. So the Russian state press has been quite negative on this film. I think the tabloid Komsomolskaya Pravda even referred to it as a film that Hitler himself could have made. But what do you think this broader society, besides this young man you spoke with, how do you think they're responding to it?
So far, I mean, based on the two screenings of Russians that have seen it in Moscow, I saw the crowd that came out after one. Nobody seemed greatly offended. I mean, you walked around and just sort of straw-polled people, what was the big deal? Nobody could really answer that. And I don't think that ordinary Russians find it nearly as offensive as Russian officials. I could be wrong. Not a lot of ordinary Russians have been able to see the film. And they did not, nobody was walking out of the movie furious, from what I could see.
So in the last few weeks, we've seen a couple of stories that we could say testify to what we might call culture wars in Russia. There's the death of Stalin. There was a case where some cadets at the Ulyanovsk Air Academy recorded a video of themselves half naked, a music video where they danced to the song Satisfaction. There was then a huge controversy with some officials calling for them to be severely punished, and then people around the country across different social groups and professional groups began recording their own music videos in support. This week there was a gay couple that married in Copenhagen and managed to get their marriage recorded or registered in Moscow. Now their passports have been invalidated. What do you think is going on here? Does this speak to something bigger in Russia?
I think that there's always been a disconnect, possibly generational, between what's going on at the official level in Russia and what's actually happening in society. Obviously, Putin continues to enjoy, as far as we understand, quite widespread support. But at the same time, a lot of people exist as part of the world, I think, in a different way than the Russian government would present. These people are on the internet. They are consuming pop culture from around the world. They're interacting with people around the world. They're traveling abroad. And they, I think, are a lot more connected than we tend to think. And I think this sort of reflects the narrative that people, that at least in the West, that people were noticing about Russian society maybe 5-6 years ago, before the current Putin entered for his current term and things sort of turned inward again. And there's been a lot of, under all the noise, I think that these currents have just sort of been continuing as they have been. And we've been very distracted by the official narrative for the past several years. And every once in a while you get these signs that Russian people are not buying it as much as we assume they are.
Mm-hmm. You've lived in Russia for several years now already. In the time you've been there, have you noticed this change personally?
I first arrived in Russia in 2012 as an exchange student, and I think it's always been there as far as I've known Russia. My entire time here, I've always felt this way about Russians, particularly in their 20s, are more alike their peers, particularly in the West, than they're not. And I think that, again, I just think that we've sort of been missing it amid the broader trends that we've been seeing. And this is part of an effect that again, most of the means of mass communication in Russia are state-controlled outside of the internet. And so you see, on the surface level, we see all the same things that Russians do. And it can be hard at times, especially from the outside, to break that surface. But I think it's been going on there all along. Muddled a bit in the patriotic fervor we've seen since Crimea in 2014 and the Ukraine conflict since. But I think it's still there, and actually this whole thing with the Satisfaction video, I think, is an encouraging sign that maybe it'll have another breakout in the near future, that perhaps this period is waning, but I think it's too early to tell. But it's there. It's definitely there, and there's a lot of signs that it's there.
And we are joined in our studio by Andriy Portnov, a Ukrainian historian specializing in intellectual history, memory studies, especially Eastern Europe, to discuss the important issue of historical memory in the region. Andriy is the founder of the Berlin-based initiative PRISM, which unites historians researching Eastern Europe, and not that often here in Kiev, so we are happy to have you here, Andriy. And of course, we can discuss a lot. You know, the memory politics plays a huge role in current Ukraine's Polish relations. But now this week we're also discussing all these cases about the banning the movies, about historical movies. You know, and this is the global phenomenon. Is it just Eastern European? Probably let's start with the, all this ban of the historic movies in Russia as well.
Okay, hello, I'm very happy to be here as well. I would say, yeah, that's probably true, this idea of like banning some art products or films. It's nothing new, it's nothing special East European, even though there is still a difference because this Death of Stalin film, as far as I understand the story around it, is not actually so much about like the actual historical event, it's rather kind of a reflection, which is based to some extent on the local Soviet story, but it is much more. It's about like democracy and leadership and autocracy and so on. But okay, we have also some examples in Ukraine, of course.
But now we are currently in the discussion, which is very sensitive. Ukrainians are very much disappointed when there would be the Western intellectuals criticizing the ban of, for instance, of the Russian movies screened in Ukraine. Poland is also going that way. At the same time, coming from Germany, you also have that, for instance, there are existing some bans for, particular remembering, if we can speak about the Nazi Germany. So as a historian, how do you see and describe this East-West divide on what is when it's okay to ban something, history, culture, and when it's not?
I would dare to say it's always dangerous to speak about East and West divides, of course, because it's like this heritage of the Cold War and even a longer history. I would say that there is a kind of difference, in my view, between the standard of academic and public debate in countries like Germany and in countries like Ukraine, which means in Germany there is much more consensus and much more normative approach to a lot of issues related to history, especially, of course, Nazi history. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's much more pluralistic on the one hand, but this pluralism also means kind of permit or permission for views that could be defined as xenophobic or racist, and they could still appear in the public debate. That's the difference. And now we should discuss whether it's good or bad, because in both cases we have a long history behind the present day situation.
At the same time, you're closely following the current situation in Poland and as well how the Poles and the Ukrainians are looking at the sensitive issues of their common history. A lot had been done in the 90s, to solve a lot of issues, the tragedies of the World War II, the issues of the killing and the murder of the Polish people in Volyn in 1943. But now there is a new, let's say, escalation. So how do you see what is happening really with these memory wars between Poland and Ukraine, and what is the reaction on, we usually hear sometimes discussing what the Ukrainian government has done wrong, but what would be the fair, assessment of that discussion?
Okay, for me at least, this kind of discussion or controversy could be defined as clash of victimhoods. So we have two victimhood narratives, the Polish one and the Ukrainian one, and they do compete. That's true, because for a lot of Polish, especially right-wing authors, intellectuals, journalists, politicians, the Volynian massacre is the story about anti-Polish genocide, which could be compared even to the Holocaust of the Jews, which is a very strong point. And for a lot of Ukrainian authors, is the story of mutual suffering, where Ukrainians actually are no less victims or victimized as the Poles are or were. Looking from a broader perspective, I should probably say that in Germany, for instance, there is a very, very limited knowledge at all what happened in Volyn. So when I've made several times lectures about it to the German public, it was a kind of a surprise, oh my God, we have no idea what happened there. It's so important for Poles and Ukrainians.
But in the Ukrainians, you probably also would have that, because there are a lot of Ukrainians who have no idea about this page of history.
To some extent, yes. But I should probably say that in both cases, official narratives, Polish and Ukrainian ones, we have, in my view, a kind of internal logic. In other words, Ukraine, in according to this narrative, needs a glorification of the UPA for some internal reasons, and of course, the war with Russia. And in the Polish case, there is another logic, the need for the Polish patriotic narrative, and not so much even against Ukraine, but let's say against EU mythologized approach, let's say, to the Polish past. And it's actually telling that a lot of Polish, present-day politicians, they would speak that we don't need this pedagogy of sorrow anymore. We need to be proud of us. this need to be proud is also kind of a historical complex, if you wish, and that is why I am rather critical about the possibility of so-called reconciliation, because I would rather assume the hardening of the claims of victimhood on both sides. I mean, official Polish side and official Ukrainian side.
So at the same, if you compare, you have this. So in that case, for instance, the Volyn massacre, unfortunately, is like anti-EU sentiment plays in case of Poland and anti-Russian in case of Ukraine, while in the end you have Poles and Ukrainians not thoroughly discussing the tragedy. And we have this discourse, it's all, we can speak that the Eastern Europe always had this issue of victimhood. But now we have also globally this issue of nostalgia, coming from Trump and Make America Great Again to, many other countries in Eastern Europe. How you usually, including Ukraine, including Czech Republic, Hungary, all the others. So as a historian following the politics today, how you see the reasons for the regions to go back to that? Is it just populism?
No, actually, I don't think it's just populism. Some colleagues of mine are talking about post-liberal moment or the crisis of the liberal democracy in post-Soviet space, which includes, of course, also this new attitude to the national past and so on. I think that both Poland and many other countries of the region, they do have a kind of challenge, if you wish, a challenge of this accepting new social, economic and political reality around us. And as a reaction to this new reality, we have a kind of a very strong traditionalist or conservative sentiment. And it was a big mistake, I should say, in my view, of a lot of intellectuals, 10 years ago, for instance, to assume that now we already live in this brave new world, which is getting more and more open-minded, less xenophobic and so on. It was too naive and too quick conclusion. And now in countries like Poland, but not only Poland, again, also in some countries of Western Europe, for instance, Great Britain even, we have a kind of this retreat or reversal of the anti-liberal, more conservative, more traditionalist, if you wish, narrative and attitude. And that's an interesting phenomenon. But it does not mean, of course, that it will be for years like that. It's always dynamic. And we should be aware of these dynamics also in Ukraine.
Do you see that trend in Ukraine as well? And you know how it all goes. So in the end, that Ukraine happens to be internationally, after the Maidan Revolution, with the real war going on, with the Russian resentment and the Polish resentment, in this situation where you also either follow the trend or it's really very hard.
What is special, in my view, in the Ukrainian case, that Ukrainian society, unlike the Polish society, could not do it so easily with the EU question. Because Poland is a member of the European Union since 2004, and Ukraine is just trying to convince the members of the EU to think seriously about Ukraine's possibility to join it. That means that our, potentially speaking, anti-European rhetoric could not just the Polish one. Because the Polish anti-EU sentiment is the sentiment inside or within the EU, and our problems, they're still the problems more or less, primitively speaking, in between the EU and Russia. And Ukraine is trying to find a place to survive and to develop itself between those two big, how to call them, master narratives or powers. And that is why I don't think that we are just following the Polish or Czech or whatever model. Ukrainian story is a bit special and also more complicated, I could also say that, because the society here is much more diverse internally than in Poland, for instance. So in other words, Poland or Hungary, they're much more homogeneous in all possible senses than Ukraine is. Linguistically, religiously, historically also, sociologically. And that's on the one hand a chance for Ukraine, but on the other hand also a danger. And that's up to us, literally up to us, how to deal with this Ukrainian diversity and internal complexity. Whether we should reduce it or whether we should, try to make it more visible, more present. That's a real challenge for the Ukrainian society, not just the politicians.
Andrei, thanks for interesting discussion. We covered kind of a number of issues, which could be, somebody would call them intellectuals, but they are really so much into the everyday life and discussion people have here on social networks and elsewhere as well. Thanks a lot. That was Andrei Portnov, who is the Ukrainian historian based in Berlin. So from the entire team of Hromadske International, we would like to thank you for watching us. We are here to explain Eastern Europe for you, and I would like you to ask to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. There you can find also on our webpage en.hromadske.ua the full version of our stories and of our reports. I also encourage you to go to the upper side of our webpage where you can subscribe to our brand new newsletter. Thanks a lot for being with us.